ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਦਿਸ ਐਪੀਸੋਡ ਆਫ ਦ ਹਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਸ਼ੋ। ਇੱਕ ਅਸੀਂ ਸੀਰੀਜ਼ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ ਗੈਰੀ ਥਾਂਡੀ ਨਾਲ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਹਨ ਅਤੇ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਵਰਕਰ ਨੇ, ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਐਸੀਆਂ ਸਮੱਸਿਆਵਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਾਣੂ ਤਾਂ ਹਾਂ, ਪਰ ਉਸ ਦਾ ਸੋਲਿਊਸ਼ਨ ਕੀ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ। ਜੈਨੇਸਿਸ ਇੰਪਾਵਰਮੈਂਟ ਸੁਸਾਇਟੀ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਮੁੱਦਿਆਂ ਉੱਤੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚੇਤਨਾ ਲਿਆਂਦੀ ਜਾਵੇ। ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਮੁੱਖ ਰੱਖ ਕੇ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਫੋਕਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਮੁੱਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿ ਚਿੰਤਾ ਦਾ ਵਿਸ਼ਾ ਬਣਿਆ ਉਹ ਹੈ ਡੋਮੈਸਟਿਕ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ। ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਉਮਰ ਦਾ ਲਿਹਾਜ਼ ਨਹੀਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਕੋਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਨਪੜ੍ਹ ਹੈ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਇਹ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਬੜੀ ਹੈਰਾਨੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਹਾਲ ਹੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ 64 ਸਾਲ ਦੀ ਲੇਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ। ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਟ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਔਰਤ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇਹ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਹਰ ਰੋਜ਼ ਵੱਡੀ ਮਾਤਰਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫੋਨ ਕਾਲਸ ਆਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਡੋਮੈਸਟਿਕ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੇ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਵਿੱਚ। ਕੀ ਕਾਰਨ ਹਨ ਤੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਐਜ਼ ਅ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਕੁਝ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਆਓ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਗੈਰੀ ਥਾਂਡੀ ਨਾਲ। ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਦ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ।
Thank you.
Thank you. So Gary, today we would like to talk about domestic violence. Again, it is found in all the cultures, but focusing on our community today, what is your experience? What are the reasons and where are we heading to?
I think there are multiple reasons that this violence may occur. And so sometimes the problem is we try to focus on one issue instead of thinking about the bigger picture. With our community, again, I do feel there's the current system of addressing domestic violence is not working. We've seen that. There's the issue isn't necessarily decreasing.
Right.
And again, there's a lot of folks trying to work on this issue. But what's missing, I think, is the community itself. I think a real grassroots effort to work on these issues, working with family members, working with other community members to talk about this issue,
right,
and harness the power that the community has to address these issues. Right now, our system basically, there's only one way to address it, really, and it's through a criminal justice system,
right,
that in many ways, again, people are trying within these systems, but that system is not working well for these families. I know from experience, having worked as a probation officer, having worked as a counselor, that services for our communities are very much lacking. There are large wait lists. So I almost felt embarrassed to say that we have these services because it would take so long for people to get into these services.
Right.
And I think in our community, when they find out, okay, say there is a victim, someone who's being assaulted, if she knew there were services that she could access immediately, and if she knew there were services her spouse could access,
right,
before these issues get to this point. I mean, when it gets to a point where someone is murdered, that's absolutely tragic, of course. But I wonder if there were places we could have intervened, or intervention could have happened much sooner in those situations.
Right.
When in a lot of these cases, if there was friction between a couple, maybe there wasn't violence yet. It's at that point, I think we need to reach these community members. And I know some people say, well, they're not going to get help, but I don't think the help's been there. And so it's hard to say. I think if we say, let's have those help and services available,
right,
maybe they will access them.
Okay.
But the experience so far for many victims, and I heard this again in when I was a probation officer, I would have Punjabi-speaking women call me and say, this isn't what I wanted. I wanted him to stop, but I didn't expect that he would be arrested and then he's not allowed home for 6 months or 1 year. He
Right.
can't see the children. And in many ways she felt further victimized because he was maybe taking care of some of those responsibilities at home. He was taking care of the bills. And so these victims felt the system hadn't necessarily worked for them. I think it's absolutely necessary for if there is violence and police are called, absolutely, police do, I think, a great job. They will, if there is a violence, they will arrest and they will separate, and that protects
Right.
the victim.
Right.
But from there, the system really slows down, and there are long court delays. There are long delays for counseling for men. So a lot of victims, they should they should be away
Separate.
from that person, and
Right.
that's the safest thing for them.
Right.
But we also know in our community a lot of victims want to reconcile, and if it wasn't for that court order, they would reconcile, and sometimes they still do. Even if there's a court order there, they will violate that order because they want to reconcile.
Right.
But they then get caught up in the system that it could be 6 months to a year through court. And the costs for the lawyer are often being paid by the victim, or it's a shared bank account.
Right.
And then on top of it, there's many, many more months, 6 months to a year for counseling. So violence occurs, and maybe 2 years later, the man might get some service. That to me is not acceptable, and
Right.
it's actually in the South Asian community, it's much worse than any other community in terms of those kinds of weights.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the services which you say are lacking, but getting a little deeper into it, the reasons for this conflict, while you interact with the people who are facing all this, what is coming out? What are the major reasons for this domestic violence?
There again, as I mentioned, there's many different factors. So for anyone working with the men or women, it's to explore all those factors. It's to find out, okay, what is the issue between the couple? Is it there's different tension about who they should be, which family function they should be going to. So there's some of those issues. There are sometimes influence from other extended family that extended family can be wonderful and very helpful, but if sometimes they can also be meddling sometimes, and that creates some stress.
Right.
There may be stress that the man has experienced when he first immigrated, and the adjustment is not always easy for him or his spouse or for the children. So that's what I mean. There are so many different factors
Finances
that can build
also.
up. Finances, absolutely. It's very expensive to live in the Lower Mainland, of course.
Extramarital relations,
That can be an issue as well. These
drinking, and all these things.
and substance use, absolutely. And
Right.
substance use, actually, alcohol sometimes is a way to cope with some of those stressors. So it becomes another problem, and it certainly exacerbates, creates even more problems.
Right.
But that's again where these things have to be explored individually. We certainly see those threads. We see
Right.
some of these similar threads with these folks that I've worked with. And so we need to ask those questions.
Right.
There may be some of that belief system as well, and that's really this is my role, this is my
Right.
and this is her role. But again, the reality is, and as a man, and we have to all kind of accept this as men, that we do have certain privileges, and they're not necessarily earned.
Right.
And so if we think that, okay, I should be the meal should be made for me, my spouse should look after the children. I
Right.
think that's not the reality.
So from the culture from where we have come, basically where it is male-dominated society. Of course, it is in other cultures also, but especially from the land where we come from.
Yes.
Though the kind of we do give lip service that women are equal to men, but definitely in practice that's not the case.
In many instances, it's not. I know many people where it absolutely is, many couples, and that's wonderful.
Right.
In others, not so much. And there was a time when it maybe even made sense in India. If I'm working on a farm, the man does the work
Right.
outside, the woman
Yeah.
does the work inside. But then
Things
men
have
have
changed
to
now.
Absolutely, and that's the part where men have to be honest, because there's men that come here and they expect those same things, and yet they're maybe living in a condominium where all the service is done by the strata fee, so they're not looking after anything outside the home. They, again, back then traditionally the woman didn't work outside the home. Here it requires often two incomes to survive. So they have to be honest and look and say, okay, that was a traditional system that made sense at that time. Man works outside the home, woman can do things inside the home. The family functioned well that way, and that's great. So that system doesn't necessarily work anymore.
Right. We'll just go for a short break, come back and continue with the discussion as to, you talked about the services. Now, if someone is going through all this, still there is a stigma attached to it. And as you also mentioned, that many families later on realize, though the police has been called, that we didn't want it to go so far, and we want to retract and we want to adjust. What is the community going to say? How will I survive? All these issues come forward. So what needs to be done, we'll discuss after this short break. ਸੋ ਹੁਣ ਤੱਕ ਜੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਉਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੈਰੀ ਥਾਂਡੀ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਮੱਸਿਆ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਡੋਮੈਸਟਿਕ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੀ, ਇਹ ਕਾਫੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਉਮਰ ਦਾ ਲਿਹਾਜ਼ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੋ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਉੱਤੇ ਫੋਕਸ ਕੀਤਾ। ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਰਵਿਸਿਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਲੈਕ ਕਰਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਸਮੇਂ ਸਿਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਜਦੋਂ ਕੋਈ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਰਾਹਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਦੀ ਤਾਂ ਉਸ ਕਾਰਨ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਖਰਾਬ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿ ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਕੇਸਿਸ ਐਕਸਟ੍ਰੀਮ ਲੈਵਲ ਤੱਕ ਹੀ ਚਲੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਰੀਕਨਸੀਲੀਏਸ਼ਨ ਚਾਹਣ ਦੇ ਬਾਵਜੂਦ ਵੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ। ਲੇਕਿਨ ਜੇਕਰ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਨਾ ਪਹੁੰਚਣ, ਉਸ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਜੇਕਰ ਸਹੀ ਸਮੇਂ ਤੇ ਸਰਵਿਸਿਜ਼ ਮਿਲ ਜਾਣ ਤਾਂ ਉਸ ਨਾਲ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਸੋਲਵ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ। ਕੁਝ ਪਲਾਂ ਤੱਕ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਨੇ ਜੀ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਅੱਗੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਨੂੰ ਤੋਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
ਕੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਰਜ਼ੇ ਦੇ ਬੋਝ ਹੇਠ ਦੱਬੇ ਹੋ? ਸਮਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਕੀ ਕਰੋ?
ਫਾਈਨੈਂਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮਸ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ ਲਾਈਫ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਮਾੜਾ ਅਸਰ ਪਾ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ ਹਨ। ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਲ 'ਚ ਹੋ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਮਦਦ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕਰਜ਼ੇ ਨੂੰ ਵੱਧ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਘਟਾ ਕੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਰਕਮ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਟਰਸਟ ਫ੍ਰੀ ਕਿਸ਼ਤਾਂ 'ਚ ਬਦਲ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕਰਜ਼ੇ ਤੋਂ ਮੁਕਤ ਕਰਾ ਕੇ ਨਵੀਂ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਜੀਣ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਮਦਦ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
1866790884 ਬਿਜ਼ਨਸ ਸੋਲੂਸ਼ਨਜ਼, ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਪਰੇਸ਼ਾਨੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਾਥੀ।
ਸੋ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦਾ ਹਾਂ ਜੀ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰ ਫਿਰ ਆਪ ਸਭ ਦਾ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਥ ਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਗੈਰੀ ਥਾਂਡੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਜੈਨੇਸਿਸ ਇੰਪਾਵਰਮੈਂਟ ਸੁਸਾਇਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਆਏ ਨੇ, ਇੱਕ ਸਾਬਕਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਬੇਸ਼ਨ ਆਫਿਸਰ ਵੀ ਹਨ, ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਹਨ ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਡੋਮੈਸਟਿਕ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੀ। ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਜੋ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੁੱਖ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਫੋਕਸ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇਨਵੋਲਵ ਹੋ ਸਕਣ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਚੈਲੰਜਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਤੀ ਉਹ ਸੁਹਿਰਤਾ ਨਾਲ ਸਹੀ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਲੈ ਸਕਣ। ਇਸ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਓ ਹੋਰ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ। So before the break, what we were talking was that there are many issues, and especially from a culture where we have come from, we feel it is our privilege to, demand things. But over here, things are different. But on the other hand, we are in quotes religious people. We believe in our scriptures, and in the scriptures, what we find is that equal respect, equal status is given to women. We get inspiration from listening to kirtan. We get inspiration from going to a gurdwara or a temple. But why is it that when it comes to that respect thing in practice, why is it that we are not able to follow it? Have you faced these issues when discussing with your clients?
Absolutely. And part of it, I think, is there is a large number of people in our community that do live that way, that do practice respectfully relationships with their spouse and with their children. They tend to be the sort of, I think they are the silent majority, and I'm waiting for someone to challenge that, but I do think there's a lot of people that are living that life, but they're silent, and they because they just live their life and they kind of quietly go about doing their thing and they're law abiding and live good lives. But I think we absolutely need to tap into that resource.
Right.
And too often we separate ourselves as service providers and say we are the experts and we can do this service.
Right.
I don't believe that. I think it's the community itself that needs to talk about the issues and talk about what needs to be done instead of right now what happens, which is a top-down approach that government says, here's a little bit of money or here's a little bit of funding and this is what we want to see. I don't think that works in many instances. It's certainly not, it's not really asking what the communities themselves need. So we have to point out those discrepancies. We have to say when people are acting one way but talking a different way, that we have to be able to call them on that.
Right.
We have to do that at the community level.
So at the community level, when you talk, do you feel that our gurdwaras and temples, their role needs to change and they can play a very important role in this?
Absolutely. I've worked with gurdwaras. I think they're more open now than ever before. I think I have empathy for them. I know there's a lot of people that approach them with different things. And when things happen, and unfortunately when domestic homicides occur, often people will, the media understandably, they will go and ask people from the temple. And so sometimes the temples have been put on the spot, but they absolutely have a role to play.
Right.
And we need to be having an open, honest dialogue. I think if you go to them and say, this is what needs to be done, I think that's the wrong approach. I think it has to be collaborative. It has to be a partnership.
Right.
And to their credit, I think they are coming around to that way of thinking.
Okay. The like-minded people need to come forward and start working on these issues.
Absolutely.
Now the question is, when a person is, a spouse is facing domestic violence, again, we talk in our community, it's more of a shame thing that if it goes out, what are the people going to say? And the things keep on boiling, and a time comes when even people get killed also. The stage goes up to that level. So with your experience, what would you like to tell our viewers today who are going through this phase, where to start from? And is it that if they come forward, and will they have some kind of safety net, if I may say that? And because there are many people who just don't want to come forward, and they're just wasting their lives in the hope that things might improve. So what would be your suggestion to them?
What I would say is kind of echoing what you said, is that we know that when there is violence, that it doesn't just stop, it will continue, and it often escalates. So I would say, get help sooner. We talk about stigma and shame, but in many ways, for the folks that feel that, I don't think they should. I think they're just doing what needs to be done to save themselves and save their relationships potentially. But anything, in many ways, what could be more shaming or stigma-inducing than being arrested, having to go to court, having to do these kind of things? I'm not saying even that necessarily is, but that's, I think if people feel that kind of concern, they should think, well, if it's going to get to that point, and in many instances it will, that is going to be as shameful as they can imagine. So why not go get help much, much earlier? It doesn't necessarily have to involve the criminal justice system, which I've mentioned is sometimes it's not going to work for someone, and they're going to feel that it's actually it's created more barriers. So reach out to the services that can be supporting the victim, but also working with the perpetrator. And we often don't have these services. But if we have those services, and they're sustained services, then we can actually say that they're there, come out and see us, and then we can, I'm sure, reach a lot more people than what we're doing right now.
Right. And when we talk about the criminal justice system, are enough efforts being done to reach to the government and get these things changed?
I think the process takes time. I've learned that from experience, that it takes time, but you have to be persistent. I think, again, people in these positions of authority in government are sympathetic. They listen. They will listen. Sometimes they're handcuffed because of funding issues. Sometimes they're handcuffed because, again, these bureaucracies and policies. But I think if there's enough pressure from the grassroots, or even the grassroots themselves saying we need to do something differently, then I think that would force some changes. I don't feel it could be any worse than the current situation, where a lot of folks are talking about the need for changes, but it's not happening because, again, funding issues, or people feel handcuffed because of the policies and procedures and bureaucracy they have to work with.
Thanks for your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
ਸੋ ਜੋ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੁੱਖ ਤੌਰ ਉੱਤੇ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਜਸਟਿਸ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੋ ਚੇਂਜਸ ਦੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਤੱਕ ਵੀ ਪਹੁੰਚਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਸਰਕਾਰ ਵੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਚੈਲੰਜਸ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫੇਸ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਉਸ ਕਾਰਨ ਸਹੀ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ। ਦੂਸਰੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਰਵਿਸਿਜ਼ ਲੈਕ ਕਰ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਉਸ ਪਾਸੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਫੋਕਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹ 9 to 5 ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅਪਰੋਚ ਹੈਗੀ, ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਚੇਂਜ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ। ਕੁਝ ਅਲਾਈਨਮੈਂਟ ਹੋਏ ਉਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਵਿਅਕਤੀਆਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਫੀਲਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਅਵੇਅਰਨੈਸ ਆਵੇ, ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਜੋ ਹੈ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਮੋਜੀਨੀਅਸ ਯੂਨਿਟ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਹਾਂ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ੇਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ, ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ਰਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈਗੀ। ਜੇਕਰ ਕੋਈ ਸਮੱਸਿਆ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਕਾਉਂਸਲਰ ਨਾਲ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ ਜਾਂ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾ ਕੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਇਹ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਸੂਨੈਸਟ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਸੋਲਵ ਕਰ ਲੈਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਲੈਵਲ ਤੱਕ ਆਉਣ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੇਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਮੱਸਿਆ ਹੱਦ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਨਿਕਲ ਗਈ ਹੋਵੇ। ਇਸ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਾਰੇ ਹੀ ਯਤਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਜੋ ਹਨ ਉਹ ਅੱਗੇ ਆ ਕੇ ਜੇਕਰ ਇਸ ਮਸਲੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨਗੇ, ਅਵੇਅਰਨੈਸ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਮੰਦਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੁਣ ਕੁਝ ਚੇਂਜਸ ਵੇਖਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਬਾਤਾਂ ਹੋਣੀਆਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਈਆਂ ਨੇ, ਪਰ ਅਜੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ। ਪਰ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਉੱਤੇ ਤਾਂ ਮਾਈਂਡਸੈਟ ਜੋ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਦ ਤੱਕ ਤਬਦੀਲੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦੀ, ਤਦ ਤੱਕ ਇਹ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੀ ਚੱਲਦੇ ਰਹਿਣਗੇ।